Thank you for coming today. I just want to thank everyone in support of this amazing conference and kind of policy session and set of sessions. My name is Joseph Weinberg. I'm the co-founder of a company called Peggy's Financial and chairman of the Shyft network. I've been advising the OECD and sort of its members over the last 14 months or so on policy requirements and the technology kind of side of this whole blockchain discussion. Shyft in particular is working on how do you build trusted data requirements for things like identity and KYC and kind of a broader set of use cases in general. So this panel is, I guess, somewhat right up my alley. And so I just wanted to kind of walk through very quickly kind of the context of what brought us here today. So the majority of the directorates kind of have different areas and different panels and different discussions throughout the 2 days that you're here. The identity one was actually brought in for a different reason. So in about November of last year, myself and my colleagues, when working and speaking a lot with the directorates of the OECD, what we noticed was one of the core things, we went through pretty much every single directorate to look at what their challenges are and the areas in which intersection might make sense from a blockchain perspective. And we found that identity, or the ability to identify things, is single-handedly the most important concept across everyone. You name it. And of course, it's really what's, a lot of what's kind of enabling and the requirements that are being looked at to enable things and use cases to solve big fundamental problems in the space. And so this is kind of what brought us here, is that we felt this panel was extremely important to look at broad areas. This session is, and this debate is huge, and we could talk about it all day. But I'll try to get to the panelists here and make a quick few intros and then start with some questions as well. Mary, do you want to start with a quick intro?
So my name is Mary Saraco. My background is more in the traditional side of finance. I used to work at UBS, investment banking in Buenos Aires and in London. Before I came to Paris, did Sciences Po for a bit, and then I went to work at the World Bank, doing especially investments in emerging markets. And 3 years ago, I came across blockchain thanks to my brother, who's a software engineer, who told me, Mary, you should get into blockchain. It's going to get you out of your job. So I started researching that, and after that I became crazy for the technology. And now I found Eubanks, which is an crypto exchange platform for Latin America, specially built in a user-friendly way to onboard all the mass adoption to use crypto. In short, Maya.
Pleasure to be here. Maya Wojnowicz, CEO and investor of O Group. I've entered into space in 2011. While I was in Africa, I started in telecom business, part of a hacker community, and infrastructure development across emerging markets. Helped develop Noble Bank, which today is a large company in the space, and then was a former CIO at General Electric, launched all our blockchain and concept of decentralization globally for General Electric. We invest today. We have a token economics firm, and we work with governments and enterprises on figuring out the actual effects or lack thereof of current blockchain technology.
I'm Dave Schreier. I'm the CEO of Distilled Analytics, which is a company that I founded that is solving the global identity crisis through predictive identity. This is a new kind of AI-driven technology to form identities that better reflect how we actually live our lives. And I'm going to get into what that means in just a few minutes. I also lead the blockchain and fintech classes at MIT and Oxford.
I'm Diego Gutierrez Aldivar. I've been in Bitcoin and blockchain since 2012, actively creating the grassroots movement in Latin America. I created the Argentinian and Latin American Bitcoin NGOs. And I'm also the CEO of RSK Labs, the company that created RSK, the first smart contract platform secured by the Bitcoin network. And my main focus is on bringing financial inclusion through the use of these technologies to our region and hopefully the world.
Thank you, everyone. So I'm actually going to jump over to David here to kind of break us down. David is looked at as one of the foremost researchers in this whole identity kind of space, broadly speaking. He's an advisor to us at Shyft as well. So Dave, we would like to just kind of get your thoughts on what are the current lessons learned from past attempts in trying to tackle this whole identity kind of space and angles and kind of what's your thoughts broadly on that area?
So before we get into the question of identity and blockchain, it's important to know how did we get into the mess that we're in right now. And I will say without question, identity is a mess. So in 1414, King Henry V issued some travel papers, some safe conduct papers that said when you travel beyond the borders of England, his hand of protection would extend over you. And today's humble passport is a direct lineal descendant of those travel papers. And we haven't really updated the system in 600 years. So it's time for Identity 2.0, because we're still working with travel papers from 1414. Well, how do we get those papers? Well, we're born. Our parents go to a doctor and they say, this is really our kid. The doctor says to the government, yeah, I was there, it's really their kid. And that's how we get government-issued credentials that establish identity. It's a very antiquated mechanism if you think about it, this series of analog attestations. That little piece of paper that has your name and your height and your address sometimes and your age doesn't really say much about who you are, but who you are is how you actually live your life. So think about it. When you show up to your doctor's office, you present a certain part of your personality, and you talk to your doctor about how your back aches or whatever. When you go to work, you present yourself in a certain way in a work environment. When you're out with your friends drinking or enjoying a nice game of chess, you are, again, presenting a certain aspect of your personality that's distinct or discrete from those other aspects of your personality. It is a persona. And the total plexus of our identity as an individual is the collection of these different personae. So to really get into this, because this feeds into the main topic, I like to do an exercise with all of you, because there's nothing that I hate more than just sitting in a room for an hour while a bunch of talking heads talk at you. So this one is participatory. You're going to turn to your neighbor. You're going to take 5 minutes, a little less, and you are going to talk to your neighbor, tell your neighbor about one of your personae, one of these aspects of your identity, whether it's who you are at work or who you are at play. You pick, whatever it is, who you are with your doctor, maybe. And then likewise, your neighbor will share with you. I'm taking notes on you. And so your neighbor will in turn share with you kind of one of their personas. So let's just take 5 minutes and do this quick exercise.
Okay, good.
Go ahead. Front of the room. Hello. Hello.
Okay.
All right. Excellent. So thank you for getting into that. It's very exciting. Who here would like to share something they learned about their neighbor?
Aruma, you go.
Shout it out.
I'm in shock that his daughter is on the panel.
Ah, okay. So we're learning about her maternal aspect of her personality.
I learned a lot, but I was like, I can't believe that her daughter is on the panel.
It's crazy, right?
Yes, yes, yes.
Who else? Who has something they've learned? And what did you learn about her? What was
What did you learn about
what was something you've learned about her?
That she is from Scotland.
Okay.
Born in Scotland.
Born in Scotland.
She's
Nigeria.
Scottish. Do you drink scotch?
No,
We can't all be me. Who else? Who else would like to share something that they learned about their neighbor? No one. You didn't learn anything. I heard that. Oh, there we go in the back. Okay.
He's not very healthy. Okay. Trying to quit smoking.
Okay. He's trying to be healthy.
There he is.
All right. This
Working
is,
on it.
He's on a path of improvement. And Steve, what did you learn? Okay, yeah, that encapsulates a lot. So these are different, we've got a lot of maternal energy in this room today. This is good. So these are different attributes of identity. Imagine if the identity systems that we went through life with did a better job of understanding us, who we actually are, as opposed to a few demographic lines on a piece of paper. And those systems then help other systems, like the financial system or the health system, or you name it, adapt to our lives. I'm going to throw this back to Joe now to take us from there.
Yeah, and I think that that's really the crux of this whole question of identity. I was kind of looking and say, I get what is identity, right? The question is that it depends, right? It depends on who you are and the situations that you interact with. We kind of all have many different masks, right? And the situation or the context is really the key indicator, and it's probably a better understanding of who I am than the outdated, address that I used to have that I don't live at anymore on my driver's license. Right? And so this is really the whole thing. And this is where I think many of us think that the future of identity really starts to become something that is dependent on the context of the situations, and how does that reinform a better understanding of who I am in a daily capacity than my birthday. Alrighty, so I'm going to now move it over to Mary and ask you a question on really why is it that identity is important from your perspective, and really why should we even care?
Good question. So let's get personal. I'll tell you a personal experience. So when I was living in Buenos Aires, I was working at UBS, then I went to live in London. When I arrived in London, I said, okay, I have to get a flat, how they call it there, an apartment. I have to get a banking account and a phone, landline, mobile line. And I thought the easiest way was to directly go to AT&T and say, give me a phone. And they said, no, actually, we need proof of address. Okay, I have one in Argentina, you see. No, ma'am, that does not count. It needs to be in London. I was like, okay. So I went to proof of address. I said, okay, let's get my flat first. So I went to my flat and said, okay, I want to rent the apartment. And they said, no, your passport is not enough. You need a bank account. And I was like, okay, fine. So I went to the bank account and said, okay, my passport, I need to open a bank account. I actually need proof of address. What is this? So then I realized, and I said, well, don't worry, it's Santander. I've got an account in Santander in Buenos Aires. You've got my credit history. No, actually, your credit history here doesn't count. And that's when I said, okay, we've got an identity problem. This is how important this issue is. And I'm talking about myself, that of course, my credit history is great. I've got a job. I traveled. What about people that do not have access to financial services? They cannot even open a bank account. They cannot even access a phone, etc. So they can live with cash. As in Argentina, you pay with Uber with cash. Then yes, you can have prepaid mobile phones, but you cannot access the higher level of services. So you can get your food, but you cannot access, let's say, you cannot get interest on your deposits and have a credit card, a debit card, etc. So you cannot imagine how troublesome my whole experience with moving to London has been, which got me into the reality that it was not only me, but 1.5 billion people around the world don't have a identity registered document. None at all, not even birth certificate. So the World Bank, and when I was there, we talked about this a lot. The World Bank did a study that said if we can get by 2030, that's one of the Sustainable Development Goals of the World Bank, is to get by 2030 all of the people with at least one document of identity. And they said that if they can get 1% increase in people having identity, an identity register, GDP worldwide would increase almost 4%. So this is why
the key to everything. And so, well, it's effectively it's really what we're kind of talking about. And the idea is to access services, I think, at least at the base there. And I guess this comes down to, of course, is the blockchain policy conversation and kind of broader conference. And so the question, I guess, is like why a blockchain in this context, and what makes that important? Maybe I'll throw that over to Diego to kind of give his initial views on kind of why a blockchain in this this situation.
Well, blockchain is a giver of truth. So the important thing on a blockchain, and it's important the security model that protects that blockchain. It needs to be an open blockchain secured by a network that has sufficient economical security. Is that once something is attested on the blockchain, it can never be deleted or modified. So as we were discussing, identity is a social construct. And so it's basically attestation of events or interactions we have with one another that get recorded on that blockchain. And it's important that for privacy reasons we don't put any sensitive data on the blockchain, because as I said, anything on the blockchain stays on the blockchain. So no naked pictures there, please. Okay? So the idea is that the only thing we want to record on the blockchain is the attestation of an interaction or the identity of somebody. And then everything else is saved somewhere else. And in the hands of those interacting. That's a very important thing. That's what Maria was saying. You know, a lot of organizations are taking our identity events, our reputation, and keeping that information for them. And the blockchain enables that we regain control of our identity events and attestations. So that's a key element here.
And I guess I'm sure I think there's a bigger debate kind of in this context as well, and just strikes my mind from a permission versus permissionless perspective. And for all those that don't know, obviously there are differences, and this is a really big question when looking at these technologies: is what systems do you use and why? I know there's a report coming out next week or so that looks more so towards permissioning. But I mean, I guess everyone on the panel, maybe I'll ask everyone openly this, on the differences and what you think is the most important thing. Is it permission? Is it permissionless? Is it a bit of both? You guys maybe want to touch, maybe you can start with Diego and work your way over to mine or something.
Well, that's completely connected to what I was just telling. What happens if I'm using a permissioned blockchain and suddenly the custodians of that blockchain decide I no longer can have access to my reputational information? I mean, that's devastating because, you know, for many of us, reputation is just something else. It's not something that is key for our survival or thriving, but when we are talking about identity for the people who is unbanked, who is excluded from our society, that's the core asset they have to be included, to be able to interact with the rest of the society. That's the key for financial inclusion. So that valuable asset could never be in the hands of certain custodians. That's an asset that should be protected for humanity and not for a single set of custodians. So permissionless blockchain is about that. It's about protecting assets that are valuable for humanity and not for a set of individuals or organizations.
And Maya, do you want to kind of jump in on this, I guess, the wider kind of conversation on this side?
Can everybody hear me? I don't know. Yeah. I think it's a really complex question. I thought I was kind of coming on a panel and be a little bit more straightforward, but everything that Diego just talked about and David brought up, these are complex issues we've seen as part of the hacker community in my previous job and as part of something I've seen at GE, which is that you know, when you look at European laws, right, I think also permissionless blockchains are a bit of an issue too, right? Are you going to put everything out there? And so that becomes a fragmentation of these blockchains, that becomes a hybrid of these blockchains. And certainly when it comes to enterprises, there are certain things that I think are going to take off absolutely, right? Provenance, IoT, I mean, we launched them, we built them. And these are things that in the future will happen, but will it happen, you know, everywhere, such as maybe aviation? Probably not, it's tough, right? Those are millions of lives that are up in the air going, and that's a really tough one, right? Do you put that on a permissionless blockchain?
And maybe this is actually a good time to kind of to move into this. So from your experience at GE, I mean, what is your perspectives from how enterprise is thinking kind of about this identity space, and where do you think they'll be kind of quickest to move, if at all?
I think I gave you the anecdote, but I always go back to the internet times and when companies had intranets and it would send an email to another company. God forbid do that, right? Because, whoa, they'll read all of our information if I do that. So that was almost unimaginable. Cloud was also a bit unimaginable. My direct boss was the vice president.
It is in some places.
That's right, yeah, and for, you know, for some good reasons, and I'll give examples of that, my direct boss was the vice president of GE and head of IT. And I was blessed to have that because he gave me a traditional IT stack as a really good route for my blockchain and decentralized mindset. But aviation, for example, David, was not able to go necessarily directly onto this because there are massive liabilities, and also there are supply chains and that you, yes, for somewhere it does fit, because once you record it on a blockchain, that attestation of device, right, you will know each way where a liability falls, right? So therefore, on your books, the liability suddenly becomes smaller, which is great. On the other hand, there's no finger you can point at one person and fire them, right? It becomes a really strong issue. So I would say where it's going to be used is IoT, is attestation of devices in transportation and cars, healthcare. I definitely see that as being used because it fits. Fragmented or permissionless blockchains fit in there as well. It's very expensive today, and it's not scalable today, but I do see it coming, yes.
And do you think there's any additional kind of challenges to enterprise from an enablement perspective as it pertains to permissionless kind of architectures, or is that?
No, absolutely.
Yeah.
I think it was Diego or David that brought it up. I think, look, the blockchain solves one type of problem, but it doesn't solve your reliability of the data, right? What I call an attribute economy, I brought it up about 4 or 5 years ago, and where I came into the space is it's a bit personal. I came into the space for 2 reasons. One, I was already involved in a hacker community, but 2, I was a refugee as a child, and we lost our identities. And so when we crossed border in Europe, right, didn't matter who, it actually didn't matter anything who we were and what we were. And really the question and the discussion we should be having around identity is, doesn't matter who somebody is, but it matters what they are. So what that thing is, what's its attributes to what David talked about. So I call that kind of attribute economy. And I do think that some of the enterprises are going to look at this in a very serious way. And I do think in some places it will just absolutely scale and there's no turning back. And everything will be based on reputation, right? It is today almost, but I think that is going to be our currency.
And David, do you kind of agree on that same kind of thing, or what's your kind of view on this?
Yeah, so a couple of thoughts on this discussion. One of them is I struggle to see governments simply giving over identity to a permissionless, open source community as desirable as some of us on this panel might feel that would be. I just don't see it happening. But what I do see is government extending some hand of protection over its citizens around the private sector use of identity information. So what Facebook has done is, and what now has been unwound by the GDPR with respect to both Facebook and Google, is an interesting example of this sort of use and abuse of personal identity information, and then government stepping in and saying, okay, we have to put some protections in place around our citizens. And similarly, for a blockchain-based identity system, we can put algorithmic protection in place to provide that guidance and assistance. So on the enterprise side, I think corporations will need some rules around them, as much as I'm a free markets guy, just because otherwise they will maximize profit at the expense of personal liberty.
And so we're going to jump to questions. Everyone, please, if you have any questions, please send it in and ask. So we're going to get to kind of a bunch of people's questions as well. But maybe just to kind of conclude on that, David, it's like, do you see that, first of all, I guess, what do you think is the biggest advantage to using a blockchain as opposed to the existing way that people have tried to do this before? I know that we've spoken before on kind of the historicals.
Yeah, I mean, let's take one sector as an example, financial services. So every single financial institution has to do its own AML KYC. They have to do their own know your client, and this means there is massive duplication of effort and information. It is tailor-made for a what I'll call a permissioned blockchain, perhaps, or at least one that has certain permission around who can put information into the blockchain, but one that now can make costs lower for everyone in the system. Consumers, small businesses, banks, all the intermediaries, anyone who touches the system now will have lower costs. And right now, AML KYC is $270 billion US a year and growing. It is 20% of the cost of running a bank. It is astronomical, and growing 5% a year. It is astronomical. So we need a better system, and this is something that blockchain is particularly well suited for, this shared reality about identity attributes.
Can I be contrarian there for a second? Because
Absolutely.
I just have to, the guys on the panel that know me, I'm all for decentralization, but I'm also quite a realist to say not all corporates are evil and not all governments are evil. There is a reason why we have strong middle classes in Japan and the US and Europe, right? It's because of these corporates a lot and because of the governments. But there are 2 things that I'm missing, which is everybody talks about blockchain as a panacea, right? And I think a lot of this audience probably senses the same. Reality is, I think we just need to stop being lazy and design processes that will actually make us cut costs. Because any technology that we piloted at GE did not necessarily give us the results that we wanted on a scalable sense, unless we changed the way we worked. Now we have to get creative how to use people for better jobs and creativity and efficiency, and then deploy the technology, versus just piggyback on the new sexy word of technology and say we're going to solve a problem. We need reliable data, right? And now a lot of the corporates have massive amount of data, and they're just in these pools, and they're extremely dirty.
You mean
data,
silos?
Absolutely, and it's dirty, right? And so putting a blockchain on top of that just increases a higher cost. So you've done nothing. So I think that conversation, right, should be a bit.
Very well said.
It's like putting lipstick on a pig. It's still a pig.
It doesn't necessarily solve the problem. There's a much wider thing. Diego, you want to?
No, I want to make one comment, because maybe it's a little bit technical what I'm going to say, but what you save on the blockchain is not the data, because that's a misuse of the blockchain. No data should go to the blockchain.
Yeah.
So what you do is you create a digital fingerprint of the event that is being tested, and that fingerprint is it's the same like with a human fingerprint. You can tell there's a relationship one-on-one with the human being, but you cannot reconstruct the human being from the fingerprint. So that's what protects privacy. So you can put you can put attestations of very sensitive data on a public blockchain, and yet those attestations don't leak any information from the original sensitive data. So that's what we are discussing. And the less connected those attestations are, the better, because then you cannot do data mining or try to infer things from those connections. So the blockchain should be used only for attestation of events, and then is to prove something in case there's, I don't know, I have to prove something to another bank that I already proved to a bank, or in the case of a dispute, I can prove that a contract was agreed among parties at a certain point in time. So I have an attestation on the blockchain of that particular document signed by those particular parties. That's what I say. I don't say the contract, I don't say the parties' names, it just need that. So at the end, the only thing we need on the blockchain is a signature that represents parties and attestations of events. That's it.
And that would be the permissionless side, where you enable that, and then you could build some sort of a cross. And that's actually much like how we look at the Shyft. It's very similar to kind of the architecture of how we do everything. Okay, so we have a few minutes left. I'm going to go to the audience's questions. We got a few here, many kind of within the areas that we've already kind of discussed a little bit. But the first one is, given the interaction of identity with government services and policies, such as immigration policy, can the state ever enable individuals to ever fully be empowered to own their own identity? Basically, is self-sovereignty really ever actually fully possible?
I hope so. Yes, absolutely. And the way I see it today is that identity is siloed. David, that's your word, but yes, it's siloed. There are a couple of monopolies. It works on a membership status kind of thing. If you're cool, you get in. Otherwise, you're out. And in that way, I see identity as the bottom or the essential things for getting a lot of social impact and a lot of economic development and progress. So imagine us getting, registered, and a lot of people getting identity registries, getting then access to financial services. Today, we talk about, access to financial services, access to infrastructure, but we're not tackling, the lower part of the pyramid. And what I like most, and this is how I talk about it at the World Bank, and the same way the internet helped, in a way, democratize access to information, the blockchain helps democratize access to financial services, for example. But for that to happen, we need to have identity in place. Yeah.
Maya?
I don't think so. I think I call this environment schizophrenic. We are entering into space where technology is highly exponential. We are, as human beings, we are very linear, and I think we're going to start seeing places and things and countries and entities that are going to create uniform systems that will be able to onload and have sovereign identity in some places where that's not going to be possible at all because of certain reasons. I don't think that there is a one-size-fits-all anymore, and so I think it's also very dangerous. And so I just don't, I don't see it happening.
So no universality.
Yeah.
David?
Well, I'm gonna go with Maya on this one. That I think in the high income on this one, in the high income OECD countries, I think there's enough rule of law.
You're not a dreamer.
I dream about a lot of things, but I try and map them to implementable reality. And in this reality of the current state, I think that the high-income OECD countries have a likelihood, and in some cases an actuality, of using blockchain to better empower our control over our own personal data and provide better access. Think of it as a vehicle for things like PSD2 and open banking. You know, these laws and regulations that have passed that have said, you know, we're going to make you, the individual, now get back your data that previously was controlled by one party or a handful of parties. In other countries, do you really want to have all of your information readily under the control of perhaps a dictator? So it is going to be unevenly distributed. And
Or
perhaps,
Facebook.
Well, yeah.
I've written a lot on Facebook, so feel free to take a look at that. And Facebook said for years, there's no way to unwind your personal data from our systems. It's impossible. And then GDPR passed, and suddenly, miraculously, you do have the right to be forgotten. Look at that.
Yeah.
So I do think, though, it will be, like innovation, unevenly distributed. And we are going to have countries that need some kind of identity solution, and yet you'll have some complex decisions to make about what are the ethics of implementing that technology in a place where there may be challenges for the citizenry as a result.
I will.
Why don't you take that one, Diego?
I will take that one. Indeed, I will throw a more cyberpunk version of this, because I think, you know, as you mentioned, we have multiple personas. We are different people in different contexts. And I think our physical identity is something we should protect highly. And not all the events need to be attached to your physical identity. So what I see is a system where we will have multiple identities. One of those will be attached to our physical identity. If I kill somebody, that needs to be attached to my physical identity. But if I cheat on Clash Royale, who cares? I mean, you know, this is like, that can be forgotten and get clean. So in that sense,
Proportionality.
yeah, I mean, that's what I think, you know, if we design a proper, you know, identity system, it should be aware of this multiplicity we have in our lives. So, you know, certain things that need to be forgotten can be forgotten. I mean, and creating reputation has a cost. So if I've been building a reputational profile for 10 years, and suddenly I cheat, for me it's going back to zero in that dimension at least. So it will have a cost, and I will try to protect that dimension, but I can be forgotten, which is good. So I will pay the price, but not a price that can be following me for the rest of the day. So we have to think, like Maya said, you know, these things in a different light, not in the traditional concept. And we were saying sovereign identity, and at the same time we were saying, okay, ask permission to the state to validate. No, if it's sovereign, who cares? I mean, the state is just one more validator of one thing. I mean, the state is validating that my father said I'm their son, that the doctor said he took me out of my mother's belly. So it's like, that's what the state is doing. It's one more validator in a myriad. So we are looking at identity as a social contract that goes beyond the trusted entities. It's bigger and richer than what we know as identity so far.
So basically, I guess the picture that looks like is that the government sets up a certain framework, but they do not always own and control every single part that sits within that. Is that the idea, effectively?
Exactly.